This week on To the Contrary.
First, how women view the impeachment inquiry. Then, Fire Drill Fridays. Jane Fonda helps rally activists to fight for climate change. And new information that could be a major win for the Me Too movement.
Hello, I'm Bonnie Bay. Welcome to the Contrary, a discussion of news and social trends from diverse perspectives. Up first, women and the impeachment inquiry.
Women favor the impeachment inquiry more than men, according to a new poll by NPR and Marist. 55% of women approve of the House of Representatives probe, while 45% of men agree. An earlier Washington Post-ABC News survey found 56% of women back impeaching President Trump and removing him from office versus 42% of men. These numbers point to a more important trend. Women, and in particular white women, are turning on the president despite backing him in 2016. President Trump still has the support of several female lawmakers, including Representative Elise Stefanik of New York, who has been front and center during the impeachment hearings as the only Republican woman on the House Intelligence Committee. Although the representative has disagreed with the president on tariffs, the border wall, and Vladimir Putin, Stefanik has defended President Trump through the impeachment hearings.
So, Representative Norton, how is it that there is a gender divide on the impeachment inquiry?
Well, consider this, Bonnie. Women led Democrats in taking back the House. In doing so, they were making a statement not only about Republicans, but about Trump himself.
Yes, this is exactly reflective of the 2016 gender gap, which was an 11-point gap, and now I think it's a 14-point gap with the impeachment. So I think it largely reflects women's views towards Trump generally.
And when you think about it, women have seen this president accused multiple times of sexual assaults. There have been no consequences. I'm not surprised they want to see him on trial.
The question is whether they would not support him in 2020, and I think women's support may drop, but it may not drop as much as we think, despite the impeachment.
Now, why white women in the suburbs? Are they finally getting a clue from women of color?
Of course, they're key, because white women in the suburbs, they hadn't turned. We certainly wouldn't have had the House back. And they seem to be far more sensitive to what, and frankly, outraged, the more they hear about Trump. And it's taken quite a lot to turn them.
But how could anybody be more outraged than after hearing that Access Hollywood tape of him talking about, they love it when you grab them by the genitals. Well, they voted for Trump,
but they voted for Trump in the last election after that's sexism.
Okay, think about the women who actually made it possible for us to go to impeachment. It was those freshman Democrats. Do you remember that list of people who had worked in national security? Many of them were those new women Democrats who were elected in districts that went for Trump. This really wasn't partisan. When the Republicans at these hearings say, oh, you just want to have these hearings, it's all political. If we were thinking politically, we would have been like Nancy Pelosi was for months and months, saying, we are not touching this impeachment because the way we won the House was winning districts that Trump won. This doesn't help us politically. But those women are devoted to our national security. They came out and wrote that letter, and when Nancy got it, she said, look, if they're willing to do it, they're in districts that like Trump and they know this is the right thing to do, we'll do it. And so I think women have sort of come to that position.
But if I were a Democratic strategist, I would be wary. I think to Patrice's point, I think that there is a lot of hostility towards Trump, but I don't think this is reflective of what might happen in the general election. And I do think
we
that
understand that.
Yeah, and I think a real challenge for Democrats is I think there's a lot of people on both sides of the political aisle who want more transparency in government and who want more good governance ordinances. But I think that we have to remember that this is sort of a one-sided flow of communication right now. Trump's not really saying anything. He's not campaigning. There isn't any sort of response. And so,
excuse me?
So, well, I'm saying that will
he was responding in real time when the ambassador was testifying.
He was saying he wasn't watching and calling her names at the same
not
time.
The way, it's not a full campaign where people are going to be hearing
I would say that
more.
when you have members of the Republican Party sitting as supposedly listening to these witnesses with signs above them with sound bites, I would say they're trying to get their message across. And instead of asking questions, they were actually testifying.
Well, I think that could be said about the Democrats as well. I mean, I think Elise Stefanik was obviously a rising star that came out of the impeachment hearings, and she's a Republican from New York, a young woman who represents, I think, an important tool for the administration, but Republicans, which is that she made it very clear about what it was and was not. But it also speaks to, you know, broadly, when women are listening to this impeachment hearing, when all Americans are listening, they want the bottom line. And you know, there you can go back and forth on what that's going to be. Now, to my point about 2020, when we look at 2018, women were voting, I think, really around health care more than it was about a rebuke on President Trump, and whether Republicans were able and conservatives were able to put forward a message on health care. That's a very different issue. Now, going into 2020, will impeachment have a big impact on women? No, because I think there's still a lot of women who will say, is my family security better now? Is my health care, or my health care options, are they important for women for whom immigration and even some social issues like reproductive rights, you know, like abortion or pro-life being upheld? Those are going to be rallying points for them, and I think you're going to see them come out, even though.
But they won't be able to avoid impeachment. And the real question is, when you put all of those things, health care, where the president stand on that? When you put all of those things on,
he's trying.
When you put all those things on the table and you pile on impeachment, it seems to me you know where the next election may be headed.
But on health care, just to divert for a moment, or diverge, with continuing to disembowel Obamacare, if you will, there are many hundreds of thousands, if not millions, more people without health insurance than when Trump took office.
Well, then you also have those people who are removed from their private insurance plans because of Obamacare, and then you have a field of candidates on the left who are pushing for Medicare for all, which would and the elimination of private health care. That's not going to go over well.
You know what I find really strange about this conversation? Our country is now debating the impeachment of a president because it is alleged that he diverted from American foreign policy for a domestic political adventure to, you know, advantage himself in the next election that, by the way, was advantaging Russia. I mean, this is a very big issue for our democracy. And I think if the Democrats were just gaming this impeachment on whether it's going to help them or hurt them in 2020, which seems like where we always end up talking, I don't think they really would have done it. I mean, I think they're trying to do the right thing for the democracy.
But when you raise national security issues, for example, I don't know how deeply people in so-called middle America delve into these things, but don't they recognize that bargaining with Ukraine was helping Russia, who is supposedly and perhaps China still our greatest Cold War enemies in the world?
I mean, I think they're going to say, I trust a president for whom it's important to end a lot of international conflicts that they don't want the United States to be in. They don't want their children, their sons and daughters to die. I think they will look at his foreign policy and say, okay, we'll trust whatever the president has to say. The president actually sets foreign policy, and I think that's what the American electorate puts him in power to do.
Well, there's always traditionally been a tension between the NSC and the State Department. But to do this kind of double channeling where the ambassador for the bilateral country she represents, Ukraine, is not read in on what is happening in communication with the White House, that's highly unusual and suspect.
There's things.
Let me ask you, because you were in the room all last week when this was going on, how about the women who testified? Do you think they changed the minds of any women? Because, for example, Fiona Hill, and of course the former ambassador, but Fiona Hill to me was really direct, right direct on point, the most memorable, I think, despite the fact that she may not have made the most important disclosures, the most memorable testimony.
And I appreciated the way she communicated and talked about what happens to women sometimes. When she said, yes, I did blow up at Ambassador Sondland. And of course, you may not know this, but when you're a woman and you express emotion, you're immediately sidelined as emotionally unstable. Meanwhile, we had Jim Jordan up there, seething audibly, shouting at witnesses, interrupting the chairman. And, here the women, all of them who testified, were completely professional, and their voices did not range. They knew they were in a box. They stayed in their box. The men were not doing that. And I think, the women watching that thought, how many times have I been at a meeting or in a boardroom or, at work, and this has played out?
Women, here, first of all, isn't it interesting how many women have come forward as authoritative, credible witnesses? America saw women who understood what was happening, who were unafraid to come forward, despite the president having said, remember, they're in the Trump administration, that they should not come. Seems to me they saw courage and authoritative courage in that.
And where was Pompeo and Bolton and others who could have done the same?
The only point I was trying to make was actually not in defense of this president at all. It's from a public opinion perspective. It's very hard to change people's opinions and, more importantly, their behavior. And so I think something that's sort of forgotten is that when people voted and when women voted for Trump, they knew he was a far from perfect person, right? And so more information about how he may have been involved with sort of bad behavior doesn't necessarily get them to change their behavior because they already know this. What you have to do when you want to change someone's opinion or behavior is introduce new information, and they're not getting that. And I think that's the thing where people are going to be surprised that, wow, women still are voting for him. It's like, yes, they already expect this from him.
You think the majority of white women are going to support him again in 2020?
Well, I don't have the crystal ball, but I think we'll have to wait and see who the Democratic nominee is. It may be a very different game if Biden gets the nomination.
And I would just say if the economy changes, that's also going to be a huge calculus.
Well, we've seen what they did in the last election just in January.
And I agree with you. That's why they're trying to kill Biden. They're trying to go after his candidacy because they know he would have crossover appeal.
What about actual impeachment? How is that going to play? And are there going to be more articles of impeachment? I mean, you read the legal the legal experts talking about this, and there's so many grounds on which he could be impeached. Emoluments. I mean, there's been so much personal gain.
The Atlantic had a story this week about the rape charge. Why wouldn't that be folded?
Well, but haven't the Democrats been clever to zero in on the one article where it would be easiest to impeach a president? He keeps piling on himself more articles. And I think you will see them surround, but I think we will continue to see the Democrats keep their focus so that the American people don't lose theirs.
But I think the voters want them to shift their focus. I mean, I think that's what we saw on the Democratic stage the other night, is that every time one of the candidates was asked about the impeachment proceedings, they wanted to pivot to a policy discussion. And I think that's very telling, is that they're out there in America speaking to voters, and they're hearing that their voters want to talk about what is the Democratic platform. And I think that puts Democrats in a very tricky position. I don't fault them for trying to go after the president. That's partly their job. But they also have to be playing offense, not just defense.
But they're not thinking politics. They're thinking oversight, which is their responsibility.
It is,
as outlined
but you
in the
can't be in just one lane.
Well,
all right, we gotta switch to our next topic. Thank you. Let us know what you think. Please follow me on Twitter at Bonnie or Beyer at To The Contrary. From women and impeachment to fire drill Fridays.
This is what we need. We need to move up to the next level, right? And civil disobedience.
For nearly 2 months, Jane Fonda has been leading protests on Capitol Hill to bring attention to climate change, even getting herself arrested 4 times. Each week, the protests have a different focus. The week to the contrary caught up with Fonda, her co-stars and protesters. The issue was environmental justice.
The devastating impacts of fossil fuels and climate change are not shared equally around the country or around the world. Any real solution to climate change must have a strong commitment to environmental, gender, and racial justice at its core. Centering the most impacted communities, respecting indigenous rights, and ensuring that no one, that no one is excluded or left behind in the transition to a clean, renewable energy economy. And that's what the Green New Deal promises.
I am an environmental activist. I am a member of the youth. I am a daughter of immigrants. And first and foremost, I am a woman of color.
18-year-old Khadija Kokar has been holding her own climate strikes, first in Detroit and now at the Library of Congress in Washington, D.C., for at least a year. She calls them Fridays for Future and invites young people to join her.
According to the EPA, Black Americans are 3 times more likely to die from air pollution in the United States. So this is not an issue of a developing country of India or Indonesia or Philippines. It's happening right in our own backyard.
So, Megan, first of all, Jane Fonda, remember Jane Fonda in the 70s and all the awful blowback she got from her Vietnam War protests? Has she redeemed herself with these climate change protests?
Well, you know, I was lucky enough to interview her at a conference that we did right after she was arrested the first time. And I said, why are you doing this, Jane? You know, you're 82 years old. And she said, you know, Megan, when I saw little Greta Thunberg, and how everyone attacked her, and that she was speaking from her heart, and maybe, you know, she actually had all the facts, but she said a young person worried about their future, all I could think of was, I want to help her. And it felt to me like she maybe saw herself a little bit. And she said, I'm 82 years old, I've got a lot of influence, what can I do to help? So little Greta's doing Fridays for the Future, so she said, I'll do the fire drill Friday, I'm gonna come to Washington. And I was very impressed with her. You could say, well, it's elitist, these Hollywood people come. But to me, it was so authentic. And the way every Friday she puts together this program is very deep and, you know, has people talking about the implications of our climate change. I'm very impressed with her.
I think elite is a really great word because I think it doesn't, I don't know, but I don't think she resonates with a lot of Americans. What's interesting, that beautiful red coat she was wearing, she said she got it at Neiman Marcus on sale for just $500. Wow, when 40% of Americans can't come up with $400 in an emergency. So, I mean, it's fine for celebrities to want to try to bring their influence and their power to an issue.
I'm just surprised that you're knocking her personally as opposed to taking her on the issue. Is it because you can't take her on the issue?
I'm just saying there's an elitism, and please jump in here, but I think there's an elitism that comes with a lot of celebrities trying to they say they're lending their star power to these issues, and I don't think they actually win people over. Maybe they just hype up those who are already on their side.
I don't know. I think Taylor Swift might have an argument with you there, but anyway,
well,
go ahead.
This is the issue of not only our time, but for all time.
And for young people.
Well, particularly for young people. A lot of us won't be around to see the climate collapse on our heads virtually. So it really does seem to me very, very important that, in fact, I am surprised that we haven't heard more. Yeah. And the reason we haven't heard more is, number one, the Democrats haven't been in power and Republicans don't believe in climate change. And two, well, you listen to your president, who even recently said he didn't believe in it.
Around the world.
And because you don't have leadership or haven't had leadership, and our bills, and we have passed the climate change bills, can't get passed in the Senate, somebody has to do the work. So who is doing the work? Thank you, movie stars, for stepping up to awaken the American people to this most critical of issues.
Last word, Sabrina.
Yeah, I mean, I don't criticize anyone for having an opinion. She's right to have an opinion, and she's right to want to do something just as much as any of us at this table are. My concern is when we have some of these marches is that it sort of glosses over things that are happening and sort of the details. So, you know, I was looking at all of the policies that have actually gone into effect around the world, because lots of countries are trying to do things. The private market is trying to do things. And it's not perfect. I don't agree with all of these policies, but we've, in effect, you know, put coal out of business here in America and in Canada. The UK has passed carbon.
Out of business. Sabrina,
Trump is trying to prop up the coal
My
industry.
point is,
my point is this, okay? People have not put coal out of industry.
There is a market.
Out of business.
I agree.
It is gone out of favor because it's expensive and because middle America wants clean air for their children to breathe.
My point was that there has already been a movement towards cleaner energy and attempts through policies, whether it's the carbon tax, whether it's alternative fuels, whether
but
it's
these
the
are not things
market-based.
promoted by this administration.
I'm sorry, and I just finished for 1 second here, which is that there are lots of things happening, and when we just get someone up to a microphone to sort of get people angry, it ignores the things that are happening and where we might want to put our attention and where you may want to double down in certain areas. Or, hey, there's more fuel-efficient cars on the roads today than there were 10 years ago. What more can we be doing on that front? Instead of acting as if everybody is just shrugging their shoulders and not doing anything. I think it's a misrepresentation, and it's it doesn't do any good for the movement.
Well, we have to switch to the next topic, but I think to not recognize that this is a president who's doing more than any president in American history to denigrate the environment.
Climate change denier.
Including, you talked about more cars on the road that are fuel efficient. He wants to get rid of the CAFE standards,
and
which,
the auto industry won't do it.
I'm not here. I don't work for the administration, and I'm not here to defend the president.
I know you don't,
I just wanted to have a more.
But you can't ignore the fact that this guy is not just neutral on this issue. He is out to destroy the environment.
That's a very big statement.
That's a strong statement. I would just say
it's true.
They're
He's letting a Canadian company come in to drill for some I can't remember if it's gas or oil in the national park grounds in the Bears Ears National Park, a Canadian company, not even an American company. You got to watch what's going on. From climate change to Me Too.
We have discussed the impact of the Me Too movement and interviewed its leaders many times on this program, but this week we saw the first palpable evidence that it has helped women, at least women in corporations. The Conference Board, a nonpartisan think tank, reports 5 CEOs of S&P 500 companies were ousted last year due to Me Too-related misconduct. Those 5 ousters represent more than 40% of all CEO dismissals last year. Cue the drum roll for the Me Too movement. However, there was some bad news for women in that report. It is that at the end of 2018, women held 22 CEO positions in the S&P 500, down from a record 27 the year prior.
So, Sabrina, what does this say about the impact, the palpable impact the Me Too movement is having, aside from generating interest and news articles and large marches? Right. That it's really impacting corporations?
Well, I think it's extremely important to be able to call out people who have bad behavior and bad actions. Absolutely. I don't think that women's success in the C-suite is necessarily tied. It's correlated, perhaps, but it's not directly connected to. And I think we need to be careful not to say that men's losses are women's gains.
I couldn't agree with you more. We have to count this as gains that when these top executives are exposed by women, well below them, they have to go. At the same time, there is no correlation, and in fact, we should bemoan the fact that there is no correlation, because you would think that a corporation, in order to show its good side, would put a woman in charge and say, see, we have learned.
Which is why, after all this time, I've never been for quotas. in the last 5 years. I'm like, all we can do is quotas because we're 51 in the world on gender equality, according to the World Economic Forum, that feminist organization.
Well, I think the challenge is part of coming out of Me Too. One of the unintended consequences is that if your male managers feel comfortable being around women, leanin.org, their survey found that over 40% of male managers don't want to have solo meetings, don't want to socialize, or don't want to mentor. And we understand that for the pipeline for women into C-suites, it's going to come through mentorship. And then I also think that there are women who just want to be their own boss, and we're seeing entrepreneurship ticking up among women. So it may not be such a bad thing if we don't see a ton of female CEOs.
Well, do you see a correlation then between bringing these CEOs down due to Me Too kind of behaviors and fewer women CEOs? The number is tumbling from 27 to 22 in 1 year.
I mean, there probably is a correlation. I think that's just stronger around the pipeline. If there are not enough women who are on the CEO track to begin with and get mentored along the way, you're just not going to see
But that's the mentor.
We're out of time. That's it for this edition. Please follow me on Twitter and visit our website, pbs.org/to the contrary. And whether you agree or think to the contrary, see you next week.
Funding for To the Contrary provided by the Cornell Douglas Foundation, committed to encouraging stewardship of the environment, land conservation, watershed protection, and eliminating harmful chemicals. Additional funding provided by the Wallace Genetic Foundation, the Colcom Foundation, and the Charles A. Freoff Foundation. For a transcript or to see an online version of this episode of To the Contrary, please visit our PBS website at pbs.org/To the Contrary.
Be more PBS.